The saloon was filled with smoke, laughter, and the bitter stench of whiskey as men crowded the stage, their voices rising in cruel delight at the spectacle before them. Shackled in iron chains, her wrists bruised and her head bowed, stood Emma, a young woman no older than 20, whose eyes carried the shadows of sorrow too heavy for her years. She had been forced onto that stage like cattle, her dress torn and dirtied from days of captivity, her lips trembling as the auctioneer's booming voice called out her worth like she was no more than property. "A bride, gentlemen." The man sneered, his hat tipping low as he yanked Emma forward. Fit for service, strong enough for work, and desperate enough for marriage. "Who'll start the bidding?" The room erupted in jeers and offers, coins clinking as men laughed, mocking her helplessness, some shouting obscene jokes while others waved their whiskey glasses. Emma's tears stung her cheeks, and her heart pounded so loudly she thought it might burst through her chest. But she refused to let them see her break. She had already lost everything, her family, her home, her freedom, and she knew that if she fell apart now, she would lose the only thing left, her dignity. Yet just as the bidding grew louder, with one drunken prospector shouting that he'd buy her just for the entertainment of seeing her scrub his floors, a deep voice cut through the chaos like thunder over the plains. "I'll take her," it said, calm yet powerful, steady enough to silence even the drunkards. Heads turned, whispers rippling through the crowd as a tall rancher stepped into the light, his broad shoulders casting a shadow across the stage. His name was Samuel Hayes, a widower who had lived on the edge of town with only his young son for company, a man known for his quiet strength and the sorrow that weighed heavy in his eyes since the death of his wife. The auctioneer blinked in surprise. "And what, Mr. Hayes, would you want with a chained bride?" he asked mockingly, trying to stir the crowd back into laughter. But Samuel's gaze never wavered, his jaw tight, his voice low and firm. "My son needs her," he said simply. The room fell into stunned silence. For years, Samuel had kept to himself, working his ranch in solitude, never stepping foot in town unless absolutely necessary. Now here he was, claiming a woman everyone else had ridiculed, not with lust or cruelty in his eyes, but with a weight of purpose no one could quite understand. Emma lifted her head, meeting his gaze, and in that moment something shifted. For the first time in weeks, she saw not hunger or mockery in a man's eyes, but something else, something steady, almost protective. Samuel handed over the payment, unshackled her with his own rough hands, and without another word, he placed his coat around her shoulders and led her out into the cold night. The laughter of the crowd followed them, mocking and cruel, but Emma didn't care. For the first time, she wasn't being dragged. Their cruelty every time she stepped into town for supplies. Still, she held her head high, remembering the boy's smile, remembering Samuel's coat around her shoulders, and for the first time in years, she began to hope that maybe she wasn't just surviving anymore. Maybe she was finding a place where she could belong, but the West was never kind for long, and the peace Emma had found was soon threatened by the very men who had laughed at her auction. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in red and gold, riders approached the ranch. Samuel saw them first, his eyes narrowing as he stood on the porch, his hand hovering near the revolver at his side. Emma pulled Thomas close, fear rushing back like a storm. But Samuel's voice was steady. "Stay inside," he told her, his tone leaving no room for argument. The riders dismounted, their leader stepping forward with a smirk that carried the stench of whiskey and cruelty. "Hayes," he drawled, "you think you can just walk out of town with our entertainment? That woman belongs to us." Samuel's jaw tightened, his voice low and firm. "She belongs to no one. She's under my roof, under my name. And you'll leave this land before I put you in the ground." The man laughed, gesturing to his men, but Samuel didn't flinch. He was a man who had buried a wife, raised a son alone, and carved a life out of dust and sorrow. He wasn't about to let anyone take from him again. The standoff erupted in violence, gunfire splitting the air as Samuel defended his home with a fury born of love and loss. Emma clutched Thomas inside, praying with every breath, until the door burst open and one of the outlaws lunged at her. In that moment, Emma's fear hardened into steel. She grabbed the rifle Samuel had left by the door, and though her hands trembled, her aim was true. The shot rang out, the man fell, and for the first time, Emma realized she wasn't helpless anymore. By the time the dust settled, the outlaws had fled, leaving only silence and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Samuel stood in the doorway, blood streaking his arm but his eyes fierce, and when they landed on Emma, They softened with something more than gratitude, something deeper, something he had been afraid to feel again. He crossed the room in 2 strides, pulling her into his arms, his voice rough with both fury and relief. "You're safe now," he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "No one will ever chain you again." Tears spilled down Emma's cheeks as she clung to him, the weight of years of pain breaking free, replaced by the strength of his embrace. And in that moment, as Thomas peered at them with a smile brighter than any dawn, Emma understood what Samuel had meant that night at the auction. He hadn't just saved her, he had chosen her, not for himself alone, but for the son who needed her, for the family they could build together. And though their love was born in chains and laughter and blood, it was stronger than all 3. It was a love that would outlast whispers, outlast sorrow, and outlast the cruelty of the West itself. And that, dear friends, is the powerful story of a bride sold in chains, a boy who needed a mother, and a lonely rancher whose heart was braver than the cruelty of the crowd. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable Wild West stories of love, survival, and redemption.